She was the most beautiful woman I had ever laid eyes on. I thought it again as the plants under her power wrapped around my ankles, the saplings encircling my body with their limbs, and I was dying. She was more beautiful. She was ethereal, the stuff of legends, fierce and protective, strong but gentle, powerful and humble. At least that's what I thought about her the first several times I had saw her. Clothed in moss and leaves, her hair as golden as wild autumn grasses, eyes as green as pine needles, and skin as pale as the white cliffs of Dover. Those were the comparisons that ran through my mind. Deadly, unyielding, and dangerous never entered my mind. Not until that day. Not until I lay dying in the grasp of her dark wrath. I guess you need a little backstory for any of this to make sense. I was born in the Appalachians, raised here too. I knew all the lore long before I was out of elementary school. Some of the legends and stories everyone listens to and is entertained by, but they put no stock into them. Wood boogers, wampus cats, elves, trolls, dogmen, and woodwives. As a kid, well, these stories really scared me, and as a teen they intrigued me, but I'd grown to accept that they were only part and parcel of my heritage. Stories meant to scare kids into behaving, and told as a way to preserve part of our history. Living in Appalachia, there are many amalgamations of folklore stories. Over the centuries, the German, Irish, Cherokee, and even some Russian folklore characters became meshed together to create unique cryptids that supposedly haunt these ancient mountains. And that's exactly what I always thought about Woodwives. My great-uncle was as crazy as a run-over dog, but he always had fascinating tales to tell. His most beloved story was the one about his woodwife. Now, Uncle Foy was a logger just like his father and his father before him. It was a family business that, with my father's generation, began to die out. I wanted to be a logger and live a life that sounded grand to me. What could be better than working back in the mountains? Just me in the forest and the machinery. I mean, of course, there were always other men around helping with the jobs, but for the most part, I could work and live the way I wanted to. Complete freedom. Yeah, I was young and full of piss and vinegar, as my granny would have said, though I could conquer the world and force my ideals into reality. Being set on that course, I refused to deviate it from it until I had accomplished my goals. That meant that I didn't date, I didn't socialize, and when the other men went home for the night, I stayed on wherever we were working. During the warm months, I slept sometimes in a hammock stretched between trees, or on the ground in a clearing where I could look up and see the stars. 3 years in, I was 21 and I still had the mindset that I was living the good life. And looking back, I'm sure my delusion was fed by the fact that I didn't date or socialize, and I rarely came out of the woods. But back then, I wondered why anybody would want to. There's always a clear stream for fresh water, animals and plants for food. I had a tent or the pull-behind camper for shelter, and my older brother, who never came to the job sites, handled the business end. He would bid on the jobs, secure them, and call me up on the radio to let me know when and where the next job was. I saw no reason to leave. A few times a year, the whole crew would leave for a couple of weeks at a time. Christmas, Thanksgiving, you know, all the usual suspects. But not me. I preferred to stay in the woods. It was one of those warm weather holidays, maybe 4th of July, although I can't really recall, that I first met my woodwife. As I sat in a small clearing looking up at the night sky and listening to the sounds of nature all around me, I heard something that was different. It was the sound of someone clearing their throat lightly, and off in the distance. My head jerked in that direction, and I saw flowing movement behind a thicket of laurels. The moon was full, and what I saw didn't make much sense. It was like a sheet of moss, 4 feet high, moved behind that thicket. "Hello?" I called, wondering if one of the guys had come back to play a trick on me. Getting no answer, I sneaked off into the wood line and sleeked through the shadows until I got to the laurel thicket. The sheet of moss was there, 3 yards in front of me, unmoving and hunched as if whoever was cloaked in it was peering around the other side to steal a look at me. A shiver of fear traced its fingers up my spine. Whoever it was, they were too small to be one of the guys. And living here, I had also heard my fair share of feral people stories. Those, though, I put a lot of stock in. I had met some people in the woods before, and if they weren't truly feral, they were pretty damn close to it. On those occasions, I wasn't alone, but this time, I was. While the worst-case scenarios flailed about in my head, I tried to latch on to a way of handling the situation. Tackle the person, take them by surprise before they had a chance to attack me. Call out again so that they would turn and I could assess the risk of danger. Hold my breath and hide until they gave up and went away. I wasn't sure how to handle it, and just as I settled on the idea of taking the lurker by surprise and tackling them, the figure spun to face me. And there she stood, pale skin glowing under the silver cast of moonlight, hair flying out in a fan, and the sheet of moss that was no longer a sheet. It was flowing green, the greens, reds, and browns so intricately woven together as to make it seem like moss. Needless to say that I stopped with my arms wide, my face twisted into a grimace of expectation that was not met, and my heart double-clutched. Pain and joy and love and trust crashed through me like a freight train, totally destroying any feelings I had earlier about the unknown person skulking around in the dark. I knew that what I was looking at was not from the normal world, and though she had human features, she was far from human. Her beauty held me tight to the spot, unable to move, unable to form coherent sentences. I was the epitome of a bumbling idiot. Her movements were swift like a hummingbird's as she darted forward, hand outstretched, and brushed my forehead. In the instant that her hand made contact with my skin, her eyes glowed white hot and then icy blue. The glow radiated through her face, and I saw the delicate bones there. Then the touch was gone, and so was she. Spinning in a circle, looking frantically for the woman, female or spirit, I didn't know what she was, I heard a whisper at my ear, soft as the whisper of silk over wood. "There's no harm in you. I'll spare you for a while." But no matter how I turned, I couldn't see her, and the voice remained at my ear until the declaration was finished. For the next 3 nights she visited me in the same manner. Each time she remained a little longer and allowed me to get just a little closer. On the 4th night, the guys had insisted that I get out of the woods for a while. They were back, one of them could stay with the equipment, and that left me no good excuse to remain. I feared I had lost my mind from being in the woods alone so much. So I left. I went to see my brother and I told him my story. He told me to slow my roll and to stay out of the woods at night. He said I needed to find somewhere in town to stay. The thing I was playing with in the woods was no female. It was either a wood elf or a wood wife, and it wouldn't end well for me. It never ended well for the humans those beings interacted with. But of course, I didn't believe him, or anyone else. They hadn't seen her, they couldn't judge her. If they had seen her, they would feel the same as me about her. And that's when I realized that it was a story that I had better kept to myself. I didn't want every Tom, Dick, and Harry traipsing all over the woods in search of that beautiful creature. She was mine, and I was hers. She had chosen me, not any of them. I went back to the woods and back to my old way of living. The guys made jokes and I nodded. Sometimes I would jab back, but mostly I would just let them talk and acted the way they expected me to act. It took 3 weeks for her to come back, and when she did, something in her eyes had changed. There was a sharper edge there in her expression. It's hard to explain, but she didn't look as soft and gentle as before. I questioned her. "Somebody do something to you while I was away? Did any of them hurt you?" And the questions went on and on. She shook her head to each but never said a word. After a couple more weeks, I had grown accustomed to her nightly visits. Just at the beginning of autumn, I knew I was in love with her. Though I had never even kissed her or even touched her, I was in love. Every day I worked as hard and fast as I could, trying to force the day to end so I would be alone to see her again. And though she never said it, I was sure that she loved me too. One night she arrived and stood shyly smiling out from behind a giant elm tree. When I greeted her, she giggled playfully and drew back into the shadows so that I couldn't see her. Laughing, I went into the dark without fear and called out to her. That silken touch on my forehead came again. It was only the second time we had touched, but in that brief caress were images that filled my mind's eye. She was elemental, shifting and changing with the seasons and the land around her. She was mother and caretaker of all in the forest. Wild things gathered around her in humble, adoring droves. Even the plants vied for the briefest touch of her hand or a stroke of her diaphanous gown. "I am the forest." Her voice came to me gentle as a light breeze. "I know," I answered, the images only just beginning to fade. "I am protector," she said. "Yes," I answered simply. "You and the others must leave and never return here." "Huh? No," I said, my insides turning to liquid. "I have to be here to see you, to be with you. Don't send me away." But she was already gone, and every day for the next week, I worked, and every night I searched and pleaded for her to come back to me. I felt like my soul had been ripped out and my heart torn to shreds. I had never felt such agony before. At least, not at that time. Anger soon replaced the agony, and instead of pleading for her to return to me, I began threatening her. I screamed my threats as I stomped through the forest that night. I was going mad, slowly mad. I stopped talking to the crew. I stopped eating. My anger consumed me. My rage was the only thing driving me. One evening, I went off into the woods with an axe. I won't lie, I felt like Paul Bunyan, but much angrier. I had begun to hate that which I had loved so deeply. She was callous and cruel to leave me the way she did, knowing I couldn't leave that mountain after all the time we had spent together. The job was almost finished. The others would leave in another few days, and I would stay. I had it in my head to stay there forever, or at least until she came back out of hiding so I could have my day of reckoning with her. She was no mother, healer, or protector. She was a witch with a black heart. Just before daybreak, I stood at the base of an ancient oak. It was the oldest, tallest tree I had found on that mountain in all of my searching. If she was an ancient thing herself, she would be close. I spewed threats for a few minutes, and when she didn't appear, I drew back the axe. Something twisted inside my chest as I looked to the place where the axe would strike its first blow. For all of my anger, all of my rage, I felt bad for what I was about to do. I couldn't have taken that tree down with an axe. I knew it then as I knew it now, but I had to make a point. I had to let her know I was sincere with my words. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I drew the axe a fraction higher, centered my weight, and leaned into the swing. And there she was, standing in front of me with her back against the tree and her eyes piercing green in the dim light from the distant sunrise. I leaped back at the last second so the blade wouldn't be buried into her heart. Had I called her a witch? Had I said her heart was black? I dropped to my knees and cried at the sight of her. It was like seeing her douse the flame of anger and quenched all the longing in my body. Her expression softened, and she stepped forward to cup my face into her hands. The feeling of her skin on mine, halting the crying, halted my breathing, and there was only her eyes locked with mine. "You are a man of your word," she said without opening her mouth, and I nodded. "You would have torn asunder everything I had created here merely to gain an audience with me." I nodded again, unsure of exactly what she meant, but certain that I would have done anything in my power to see her again. And I was almost sure that was what she meant. "You want me," she said. It wasn't a question, more like it was an observation only. "More than anything in the world," I said, getting to my feet. Hope stabbed through the gloom like a ray of sunshine on a rainy day. Smiling, she nodded once and took my hand. Tiny vibrations moved from the point of contact, up my arm, and through the entirety of my body. Is this the thrill of love, I wondered, following her without hesitation or question? She led me into a moss-covered grotto and motioned for me to sit. I let go of the axe. I hadn't even realized I had carried it all that way. It was of no consequence. The only thing in the universe was her standing in front of me and smiling as she raised her hands high and began to dance slowly and seductively. She moved like the wind, flowing, graceful, and light. One layer of the gossamer gown pulled to the earth and was almost immediately absorbed. Then another layer and another, and she danced with greater abandon. Another layer. God, how many were there? How long until I would be rewarded by the sight of her nude figure in the soft light of dawn? One more layer and I could see her shape through the remaining material. Perfection. Another sheer layer was gone, and the next she tossed at me, giggling as she crossed her arms over her chest. I grabbed for the flimsy material, and it disintegrated at my touch, bursting into a million sparks and raining to the ground, only to be extinguished by the damp and the moss. Then she was nude and moving toward me with delicate steps that didn't even leave depressions in the moss underfoot. Tenderly, she put her hands against my shoulders and pushed me to a prone position. And let's be honest here, I didn't put up a fight. I didn't mind one bit, and I'm sure I had the stupidest grin in the world on my face because I thought I was in for the treat of my life. But then, the first rays of sunlight traced into the grotto like giant fingers scraping away the darkness. She glanced over her shoulder at the rising sun. Her hair cascaded over her nude form, and I reached out to touch it. Would it be as satiny as her skin? And suddenly pain shot through my ankles, and she turned, her small hands on my wrists. She wasn't beautiful and alluring anymore. Her face was twisted, contorted, peeling bark, and her hair spiked like the quills of a porcupine. Her teeth were sharp and full of venom. Her eyes had turned into yellow viper eyes. I kicked at the bindings around my ankles and struggled to free even one of my hands. I had to get away from the hideous thing straddling me, and every time I bucked, the thorns that covered her thighs bit deeper into my sides, drawing blood and screams in equal measure. "I thought you wanted me more than anything in the world," she hissed, her forked tongue darting towards my cheek. All I could do was scream the word no over and over and over as I doubled my efforts to get loose. I got one foot out of whatever binding she had on it, but the others was stuck, and the restraint was tightening every second. I would do anything to get free. If it meant losing a foot, I was okay with that. Striking close to my face like a snake, she grazed my collarbone with those needle-sharp teeth, and when she did it again, I tightened up and jerked my whole body to the right, twisting my wrist as she was momentarily knocked off balance. The thorns tore into my skin and scraped my rib bones, but I couldn't allow the pain to stop me. I had to get the axe. It was my only hope of surviving, if I had a hope of surviving at all. My fumbling fingers wrapped around the familiar handle, and I wrestled it from the ground. Seeing what I had done, she sank her teeth into my left shoulder. White-hot pain coursed downward as her venom flooded into me from the wound. Teeth clamped tight, eyes squeezed shut. I swung the blade blindly toward the thing causing me so much pain. Soothing coldness replaced the superheated pain, and the body on top of mine convulsed, digging the thorns in deeper. The band around my other wrist released, and I struck at her center mass as I opened up my eyes. Her head was missing. She was only that deformed, twisted aberration of a body twitching with death throes that remained. I flung it as far as I could, and I stood on my free foot. The bindings on the other foot was a rope of many plants and roots, which pulled downward so hard that several of my small bones broke. I chopped at the living rope with the axe. A million screams tore through my head, and I was finally free. I tried to bolt away from that place, from those things, but my foot was ruined, and I fell flat. And she wasn't quite dead either. Her mouth moved, and the voice that came from it was soft and strangled. The language was unlike any I've ever heard. I dragged myself 10 feet to the nearest outcrop of rock, and I pushed to stand on my good foot. Using the axe like a cane, I hobbled. I had no desire to go back and face her to finish the job. Anything that could still talk after being beheaded was something that I couldn't kill. I wanted away from the forest, away from the mountain, and I promised God that if he would ever get me out of there alive, I would never go back into the woods again. What felt like hours later, I made it to the edge of the wood line. I could see our machinery sitting silently under the lifting mist. It was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen in my life. And before I made the clearing, a stand of saplings shivered, bowed, and began to move rhythmically. No, I thought in a panic. Just a few more feet, and I'll be in the truck. God, please, let me make it that far. Just that far, and I'm a completely different man forever. I had lost my ability to speak out loud, so the prayer looped in my thoughts fast and furious as I started through those saplings. Tendrils shot from the ground, wrapping my legs to my knees, and anchored me to the spot. I screamed as they pulled down, as if trying to pull me into the earth. My ruined foot turned and broke at the ankle. I screamed louder and began swinging the axe. The saplings bent and wrapped me up like a swaddling blanket before pulling in opposite directions. I tried to swing the axe. The trees were going to rip me apart if I didn't get free. Warmth bathed the left side of my body, and pain rocketed up from my broken ankle. And with a wet, popping sound, my body shifted violently to the right. Nothing had hold of my arm any longer. I reached with my left arm to get the axe so I could swing with my free hand, but no hand came into view. No arm either. Now, let's be clear here. I felt my muscles tighten, my arm bend, my hand open. But there was nothing there. Jerking my head to the left, I looked down to see that my arm was dangling from my shoulder by stretched sinew and torn muscle. Blood gushed from the wound, and the world started to fade to black. At first, I thought the sun was setting again, and then I understood that I was passing out. Now, I don't know why she didn't finish me off right then and there. God knows she could have. But I woke up some time later. I had no sense of time or place, and I woke screaming and fighting. My brother was there. She calmed me down and said I was safe. For a flicker of a moment, I almost believed him. There were questions, but I didn't have any answers. And for the first few months of my recovery, the crew made an effort to come see me at least once or twice a week. Then the visits dwindled until they stopped completely. My brother stayed, and when I was able to live alone again, he came by every evening to check on me right up until he died last month. I told him the truth of what happened. That's been decades ago. I'd just been sent home to finish my recovery, and I thought it would be good if just one person knew the truth. But, of course, he wasn't having any of it. Hell, he didn't even believe a word. Said I was delirious from blood loss, and it was obvious that I had been mauled by a mountain lion or a bear and dragged through the woods. He reminded me that I was damn lucky that the crew showed up when they did, or I wouldn't have been alive. But yeah, I was real lucky. The doctors fixed my foot and ankle, but I have more metal in there now than actual bones. Aches like a mad bastard every winter and spring. Just a reminder in case I forgot what happened. And that would be impossible to do with a missing arm. Now, there was nothing they could do about that. They tried to get me to use a prosthetic arm and hand, but I refused. I'd rather look in the mirror and see nothing there than to see something so obviously not a part of me. Now, I often wonder, if I had left that mountain and forced the entire crew to go with me, if she would have been waiting at the next job we worked, would she have just allowed me and the crew to go on cutting down trees and destroying what she had created? Did she create any of it? Was she God? Or a god? Well, I don't think so. I think she's the same thing that drove my great uncle loopy in the head. A woodwife, a wishwife, a moss wife. You see, she has many names, many sisters, and countless victims. What's that? You have a question? You want to know if I ever went back into the woods? Well, what do you think?